sometimes when I watch Game of Thrones, I cannot physically sit still because of how much I want to punch Joffrey Baratheon in the face. Why? When I watched Les Mis, I cried continuously from the first bar of I Dreamed a Dream till the end of the first act. Why? Whenever I watch a film with Michael Fassbender, I kind of fall in love. Why? I mean, I know that these characters and these worlds are not real. They're explicitly false. So why do we all sometimes feel as though the characters and the worlds we see on screen or on stage are more real than our own experience? The key to that would essentially be emotional truth, which in the context of acting I would define essentially as the authentic relationship between emotion and expression. And as an actor, that is very much at the heart of what I do. However, as a human being, it is at the heart of who I am. Because emotional truth isn't just something that exists for actors. It affects us all the time, more strongly and in more ways than I think might be natural to assume, which is why I have developed a revolutionary model to contextualize this so that you can better understand it. I present now, for the first time, the psychophysiological spectrum. Thank you. I mean, it's a silly model, of course, but it does serve a purpose. As human beings, we have this tragic tendency to compartmentalize the mind and the body as separate things, as though they somehow don't have any relationship to each other. This is, of course, false, as many of the speakers today have demonstrated. And yet, it's sometimes hard to engage with that kind of idea that there is a spectrum, and so here's a visualization of the spectrum between the cognitive, emotional, and physically embodied human experience. You could also think of it in terms of processes on the plus side and systems on the minus side. If you want to focus on the processes, you could populate it something like this. If you want to focus on the systems, you could populate it something like this. The details don't actually matter too much for the present discussion, so let's just consider it a series of interconnected systems going upwards, always interacting and relating to one another. Emotion, in this case, is somewhere in the middle, and emotional truth relates to how that emotion is channeled throughout the rest of the system. Now, here's an example of when that doesn't work. I've been nicknamed 3 times in 3 different countries Spock. I was always quite clever as a kid, but I didn't really get the whole social thing. I actually used to spend quite a lot of my lunch breaks in primary school just watching the other kids from behind trash cans and walls and trees. I'm not joking, I wish I was. Just analyzing intellectually what they were doing intuitively. And I mean, this is sad and miserable and all that, but it actually paid off because by my teenage years, I had a pretty good understanding of social dynamics. And I was starting to implement it practically. But by then, of course, the backlog of isolation and loneliness and bullying kind of caught up with me. I began self-harming. I spent 3 or 4 months in a psychiatric ward where I was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome and clinical depression, and I tried to commit suicide. Sad times were had by all. But essentially what you're seeing is a disconnect between the mind and the body. That was the way I was dealing with people. And then I went to acting school. Weird choice, right? It was essentially an all-or-nothing gamble on my life, and there you see the same kinds of integration. So this is a character sheet I developed in my second year. I used to make these for all of my characters. You don't need to look at it in detail. Just a bunch of different ways of analyzing character, which I thought would enable me to play those characters more truthfully. And that was absolutely not the case. It just didn't work. Fortunately, my acting training was very physical. We did a lot of movement classes, dance classes, focused a lot on character posture and character walks. And it was really fun, and I realized that emotion is intangible to the intellect by itself. The key to engaging truthfully with emotion is in the body. And I'd like to demonstrate this using a couple of acting techniques. So in my second year, we devised a play in which my character loses his daughter, and a week later discovers that she's dead. It was a hard scene to play. So the first technique I used in order to engage with this was emotional memory recall. In emotional memory recall, which is a method acting technique you might be familiar with, you remember a time when you felt a certain emotion that corresponds to the scene you're playing, and you allow that emotion to flow out into the imaginary world. Now, this seems like it's just based on cognition, but actually what you're encouraged to do in emotional memory recall is focus on the physical sensory detail of the memory. So in my case, I focus on the funeral of a friend of mine, and I thought of the grave dirt hitting my shoes, of the wind in my face, the sound of the shovel, the perfume of the people I hugged. And this was useful. The second technique I used was Michael Chekhov's psychological gesture, in which you perform a gesture that makes you feel a certain way. You try to be really open to that feeling, and then you externalize that back into the gesture. So you might scrunch up your face, and it'll make you feel sad, and then that sadness gradually becomes real. And that worked fairly well until one rehearsal when I got my cue, which was, she's dead. They found her body washed up on the Isle of Dogs. They need us to identify the body, but they're sure it's her. I'm so sorry, Adam. And instead of applying either of these techniques, I just heard in my head a voice crying, Lily. And that was my first experience of real acting. This wasn't really it. But it was very powerful. I understood the effect that engaging with emotional truth really could have. We've now examined sort of the flow of emotion through this whole psychophysiological spectrum. But there's another aspect to acting, which is character. Character forms the underpinnings through which emotion flows. It's like the highway, and emotion is the car. Now, we all have our own characters. They form quite naturally as part of our biology and the sets of associations we use to create the world. Now, in neuropsychology, one of the phrases you often hear thrown around is neurons that fire together, wire together. Associations perpetuate themselves, they become stronger. Same thing applies in the body. Your body adapts to the kinds of muscular movements you use, and they become more able to perform those motions, sometimes at the expense of others. Same thing counts for instincts, emotion. The whole system functions along these lines. Now, evolutionary speaking, of course, this is what needs to happen. It's advantageous. We're able to analyze situations quickly and engage with them quickly. But sometimes things go wrong. And often the things that go wrong keep going wrong for those very reasons we just discussed. And there are many ways in which this happens. But one of the primary causes is trauma. Because when you have just a purely cognitive association, that's very easy to change. Oh, Oslo is the capital of Norway, not Sweden. Gotcha. You make the shift. It's very easy. But if what you are realizing about your schema is related to your sense of self, of who you are, that's not as easy to change. And furthermore, that is the most important myth that we tell ourselves, who we are, that gets so easily sidetracked by emotionally tumultuous events. So in my case, I wasn't receiving any positive feedback from my peers. I was doing very well academically. My myth was that I was some kind of perfect superhuman, an alien or a robot or a wizard or a Jedi or something. I read a lot of fantasy, okay? And yeah, that sustained me for a while. And then I got my first point off an exam. Yeah, 100% in English, 100% in Norwegian, 100% in physics, 99% in maths. And my reaction, obviously, was to run out of the classroom crying, run home without my shoes, without my bag in the middle of the school day, and cry for hours. It crushed me. It took me days to recover. I am not joking. Now, what had objectively happened was of no consequence whatsoever. The factual truth was that I got a point off an exam. The emotional truth was, you are human. You are fallible. You are nothing. Emotional truth is a powerful thing. You can't just argue with an anorexic person. No. Factually, you are very, very skinny. You need to eat more. If their emotional truth says that they're obese. Now, this manifests in a myriad of ways. We all have our own personal mythology. We don't see things purely. It all gets channeled through our systems. And we really run the risk of having a disconnect between our intellectual understandings of who we are and our emotional understandings. Now, this develops over time. So here is the system as it develops. Here's a happy child. Children exhibit emotional truth all the time. This is not something that we naturally lose. It's not like it's just a fundamental part of growing up. It happens to us trauma by trauma, association by associations that get ingrained. They coagulate, they petrify, they stiffen, they harden, and we end up communicating without really engaging because we're afraid. We're afraid that the myth of ourselves will be challenged. And so we become damaged. It happens, you know. But by engaging with our emotions intellectually, by trying to understand the emotional component of our rational understandings, we can start to bridge that gap. It's one system, not two. Now, this year's theme for TEDx Cambridge is connecting the arts and sciences. Now, I believe that this is hugely important on a cultural and an academic level, but I think it's vital on a human level. Our arts are an avenue to our emotional truths. These sciences are the primary avenue towards intellectual realizations of the world. But just like these two systems are not two systems in our bodies, they're not two separate faculties. We define them as such. But doing so disconnects us. On a personal level, we become hardened, we become anxious, we become afraid, we become disconnected. The way we connect to people, empathy, relies on incorporating someone else's understandings of the world into your own. It requires mental flexibility. And so I urge you, for whatever process is appropriate for your particular constellation of associations, whether it be yoga or meditation or dance or singing, arts, psychology studies, philosophy, try to examine your emotional lives rationally within the context of your embodied experience. And we can gradually work on becoming more rational, happier, better connected, and more caring. Thank you.